Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this opening session. This session about the Arab-American relations, these relations that are more than 2 centuries old now, in which the focus may every now and then is different. In the beginning, the cultural and the commercial and intellectual aspects dominated the American interest in the region, especially in the 19th century. Then it changed to focus on business-like aspects, but more than geostrategic when oil was discovered in the region. And the changing aspects in the Arab region has led this Arab-American relations to go into a different context, the context that's different from the past, whether during the Cold War period or after the Cold War period, and even the post 9/11 period. The Arab-US relations will be reviewed in a particular way, especially its beginnings will be reviewed by Ambassador Richard Murphy, who had worked in American diplomatic corps for a long time. He was America's ambassador in several Arab countries, including Mauritania, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Mr. Murphy was assistant the State Department for Middle East and Asia from 88 to 1989, and then he was a senior researcher at the Center of International Relations in New York. I give him the floor.
Well, thank you very much, sir. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to be told that in the next 10 to 15 minutes you will get a complete and detailed picture of American interests and attitudes towards the Middle East between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second. Just before the First World War ended, our President, Woodrow Wilson, called for the territories to be, which would be freed from the Ottoman Empire, to have what he said described as an absolutely unmolested opportunity of autonomous development. It was part of a speech he made to the American Congress, very well received, 14 points outlining America's stand towards the issues as the war was winding down. But that aspect, that statement about the territories of the Ottoman Empire was doomed by the policies of America's wartime allies, Britain and France, and basically unsupported at home, whether in the American Congress or the American public at large. Isolationist sentiment, which is an on and off phenomenon in our political thinking, prevailed. Washington generally deferred to British and French decision-making in Iraq, in the Levant, Palestine, and to the British as the dominant foreign power in Egypt. Wilson was one of our leading intellectuals, had been president of Princeton University, but he could be remarkably casual in his diplomacy. And for example, he had privately endorsed the Balfour Declaration without apparently drawing any connection between that and his public stand about unmolested opportunity of autonomous development. It's this sort of contradiction which has fostered the accusation of hypocrisy in American policy making. Of course, we have struggled, as all countries do struggle, with how to balance our national interests with our values in formulating foreign policy. However, during the interwar period, this accusation was rarely made by Middle Easterners themselves. They correctly perceived American interests in their area as limited. And they viewed the American image as largely benevolent when they thought about it. There were some cultural ties stemming from missionary activity in the region in the 19th century, and notably carried forward as educational ties by the American University of Beirut and then by the newly founded American University in Cairo, both of which operated independently of any US government direction or funding. There were donors from the region. There were individuals whom the university officials would appeal to back in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, that this would be an act of benevolence to help an educational institution such as the American University in Beirut get started, and helped it to build its programs. President Wilson was at the same time intrigued, as various American leaders have been over the years, of the prospects of playing a role in relation to returning the Jews to Palestine, inspired by his biblical studies. And this was, today it's hard for Americans to recall themselves just how imbued, how profound the extent of biblical studies had been in the 19th century and in the formation of thinking such as Wilson's. In the 1930s, the United States rarely involved itself in the world beyond the Western Hemisphere. We supported the efforts of American oil companies to gain access to the Eastern Arab world, where Britain had sought to monopolize exploration and production. Big oil, which had been a very hot issue in American politics, 1900, 1910, that concern about the major companies such as Standard of New Jersey, the concern had subsided. And the administrations in the 20s and 30s were ready to push for admission of the American oil companies, first in Iraq and Mesopotamian oil development, then in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. It was the fanatic conviction of some American engineers that led to endless efforts to find oil in Saudi Arabia. The British had told them there is none, or there's such a limited quantity, we are not interested, you can do what you want there. They came to regret that before too many years had passed. But otherwise, Americans at home were preoccupied with the Great Depression, unemployment at 25% of the American workforce, and President Franklin Roosevelt's programs of the New Deal to revitalize our economy. Public opinion certainly was aware of communism, of fascist movements, but they strongly opposed American involvement in the growing European crisis. It's a curious fact of history, again looking back in contrast to developments in the post-World War II, that there was suspicion of the Zionist movement, even among prominent members of the American Jewish community. There was a bit of a social clash that, as one leading spokesman of the establishment said in New York, these people are vaguely unsavory, those who are trying to come to the United States and deflect us from our goal of full assimilation into the American population. The ranks of the federal government concerned with the Middle East included some pretty notorious anti-Semites who opposed special arrangements to rescue European Jewry in the immediate pre-World War II period. It took the Holocaust to transform and swiftly transform both official and public attitudes. We had supplied our allies during the First World War with oil. Churchill had been very proud of converting the British Navy from coal to oil, but there was a great anxiety and competition for oil to supply the armed forces during the First World War. We didn't share that. We were exporting a quarter of American production. And it wasn't until the Second War when the first panic was announced on the part of American officialdom. I think it was our Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes, who warned of how catastrophic it could be if we continued to draw down on what he conceived of as a very limited amount of oil for world consumption. It was President Roosevelt's meeting with Saudi King Abdulaziz in 1945, a little beyond the period I was assigned, which led to very public pledges of access to Saudi oil for the American market and the world market, and American security for the kingdom. And this introduced a new American focus on the Middle East. Our policy developed rather rapidly during the war and in somewhat surprising ways. Roosevelt had received an appeal from the American companies operating in Saudi Arabia to make funds available to the king. The country was cash poor, and he shrugged. This was 1940. He shrugged and said, Saudi Arabia is very far away, let the British handle it. Well, 2 years later, he was talking very differently. Ickes was promoting the takeover of American oil companies by the American government, which was fiercely and successfully resisted by the companies themselves. We came out of that war flushed with victory and confident of America's conflict-solving abilities. We became more active in the Middle East. President Truman was motivated to override his closest advisors on the recognition of Israel. But then President Eisenhower very brusquely told the Israelis and along with the British and the French to get out of Suez with a bluntness which you've rarely seen out of Washington since that time. We asserted leadership in the Arab-Israeli peace process, and we resisted European and United Nations efforts to play independent roles as peacemakers. With all this came a difficulty in reconciling American interests and values in a way that Cold War competition with the Soviet Union both stimulated and constrained. So those were basically the remarks I wanted to make about that period. When Wilson talked to the American Congress, 1918, and then met with other leaders in Versailles, he was trying to apply American values to the world at large. He was fond of rhetoric about a new world order, but his ideals were frustrated, as I said, by the ambitions of the old world and by the isolationism among his own people. Roosevelt and Truman used rhetoric very similar to Wilson's when they spoke of their visions of a better world to follow the Second War. And Soviet expansionism constrained Truman's programs, but his vision of the need for American leadership has remained a constant guideline for American policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Ambassador Murphy talked about the idea of the changing in the American interest in their relations with the U.S. Arabic region and focused on the period between the two wars, and spoke about the realism and idealism of American engagement in the Arab region. In the second intervention, we'll speak a closer, historically closer period. The speaker will be Dr. Mahmoud Hamad, who will be speaking about a region long forgotten, the United States and the Arab world. Dr. Hamad has two academic posts, one associate professor in international relations at Derek University, and also associate professor in political in University of Cairo. He gives lectures in two other universities, obtained his master's degree from the University of Cairo before obtaining his PhD from University, United States. I give him the floor.
What I'm going to say today is probably going to go against the grain. I teach about American politics in Cairo. I teach about the Arab world and the Middle East and the United States. However, if you look closely enough to the emerging realities of Arab-American relations in the past decade or two, you would definitely come to the conclusion that the Arab world is far less important today from a United States perspective than any point in time in the recent past. Why is that? The thesis I'm presenting here is threefold. We, as the Arab world, are less important, firstly, because of the decline of the strategic significance of the region. Second, because of the failure of Arab governments to create a powerful lobby in the United States. And thirdly, because of the increasing significance of other regions, mainly Asia-Pacific, in the United States foreign policy perspective. So I'm going to provide a few details, and we can explore more in the Q&A session. The United States strategic interest in the Middle East that emerged mainly after the Second World War, when the United States replaced Britain and France as probably the Western dominant force in the region, dependent on three important criteria or foundations. First, combating Soviet expansionism, containing the communist threat, maintaining Arab supply of oil, and ensuring Israel's security. As we all know, the Soviet Union is no longer with us. So the strategic significance that the Middle East exerted or the Arab world exerted during the Cold War is no longer relevant. There is no strategic competitor to United States interest in the region. All Arab elites and their competitors, principal competitions, are basically in conglomerate, in conclusion, or in accordance of basically trying to establish good relations with the United States. Egypt is one example in mind. President Mubarak had strong ties to the United States. Some might call it dependency on the United States. President Morsi's short tenure in office did not change that. The current regime, the generals who control the political scene in Egypt today are principally proteges of the Pentagon. So rather than some fiery rhetoric for public consumption, there is nothing in the Middle East, no elite in the Middle East, that basically is maintaining or creating or implementing any foreign policy initiative that could hinder vital US interest in the region. Oil was the second important feature of the US-Arab relations. The United States helped produce oil in the Arabian Gulf, Persian Gulf, regardless whatever you want to say it. And with the oil embargo, the oil supply from the Middle East became imperative. The United States established Central Command afterwards to basically ensure supply of Arab oil to the international market and principally to the US market. But the United States, after the oil embargo, basically vowed that the oil would never be used again as a political tool in foreign policy. So a number of policies were implemented domestically to ensure that this would never happen again. The United States started increasing its domestic consumption, diversifying its oil imports to principally rely on credible partners, mainly in the Western Hemisphere, Canada, Mexico. And the results of all of this is that the United States only imports from the Persian Gulf something like 25% of its oil today. So oil would not be used again to influence or shape US foreign policy, at least in the short term. The third principal foundation of US-Arab relations or US interest in the Arab world was Israel. The United States' relation with Israel dates back, or the Jewish state dates back to even prior to the establishment of Israel in 1948. Since the Baltimore Conference in 1944, the Republican and the Democratic Party basically agreed that the establishment of a Jewish state is something that the United States would support. So it was no surprise that the United States was among the first few nations that actually recognized the Jewish state in 1948. The United States had to intervene in the 1950s and 60s to basically ensure the viability of Israel. The United States had to intervene directly in the 1973 war. The United States had to send Patriot missiles during the 1990 war. I'm arguing here that Israel is far less dependent politically, militarily, and economically on the United States today. The Israeli army is far superior than most of the Arab armies, if not all. Most of the Arab armies today are inbound, basically functioning as domestic security forces, which gives very limited time for training for foreign or national defense. The Israeli public, on the other hand, is dwarfing far and far to the right. I would argue that there is no political alliance in Israel today that would welcome or even encourage US involvement to bring a viable peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. There are even those in Washington today that argue that US involvement, US presidential involvement, especially the Clinton administration, in trying to bring a comprehensive peace between the Arabs and the Israelis was counterproductive. It detracted from the prestige and power of the presidency, and that the United States should not do that again. Israel, discoveries of natural gas and oil in the Eastern Mediterranean is also making the Jewish states much more powerful in the energy sector. Remember, Egypt under Mubarak used to export natural gas to Israel. There are rumors today that Egypt would import natural gas from Israel. So the region as a whole is losing its currency, it's losing its credibility in the eyes of US policymakers. But that's not it. Part of the blame has to rest with us, Arabs. It was famously said that in the United States, foreign policy making is local politics, and local politics is usually ethnic politics. And that's why, for example, you could not explain the US policy toward Israel or the US policy toward Cuba without taking into consideration the influence of the two lobbying groups that represent those two ethnic groups. The Arab states had failed to create a powerful lobby in Washington for a number of reasons. I think the most important of all is that we basically don't understand the United States. It was famously reported that in the 1950s, President Nasser asked what a lobby means. What does the term lobby means? What does the term picket line means? Until 2000, there was no single Arab university that had a program on American studies. Most of us Arab academics who studied in the US don't study American politics. There is very little people-to-people relationship, especially with the heartland. Arab governments who spend huge sums of money on hiring professional lobbyists and professional public relation firms fail to coordinate their efforts. There is no synergy in Arab lobbying in Washington. In most cases, many Arab nations would lobby against fellow Arab nations that detract from the overall significance of this lobbying efforts. Arab Americans are growing in number. However, their political influence still or remains limited. And the same could be said about Muslim Americans. That's why it's rather unfortunate that we as Arabs, governments and people, have very little understanding, very little influence, very little relations with the American polity and the American public. But that's not it. The third and final reason why the Arab region is losing its significance today is that because of the rising significance of the Asia-Pacific region. A superpower like the United States don't have the luxury of ignoring any region in the world. However, any superpower, any nation has to put into context how to manage resources. Would the principal foreign policy maker, the president, the Secretary of State, or the Secretary of Defense take a prime interest in one significant area or not? And the Arab world was, or the Arab region was, among the top strategic areas in the, I would say up until the Bush administration. That is not the case anymore. There is growing significance on the in Washington on the Asia-Pacific region. There is principally also fatigue about the Arab world. After fighting 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, after the massive loss in blood and treasure, there is an emerging agreement among the American public that there is very little to gain from the Arab world. If you take into consideration the struggle of the US economy and the need to base US foreign policy on economic ties with regions that are growing in significance, the miserable record of economic development in the Arab world does not position the Arab region to compete for US attention. Among the 20 most important trade partners to the United States, only Saudi Arabia comes in number 10th with about 1.8%. Most of US trade is with Canada, Mexico, and the Asia-Pacific region. There is no wonder then that there is an emerging agreement about the need for what we call the Asia pivot, or the pivot to Asia. A month or so ago, President Obama was visiting the region, and that was highly reported in the media. What was not reported is that a high delegation from Congress, led by Paul Ryan, and fellow congressmen were visiting the region at the same time. In conclusion, what I'm trying to say here today is that the region is far, far less important today to the United States. There is no clear and present danger to US national interests in the Arab world. The United States is learning how to cope with the terrorists and other threats in the region. And that's why, for example, you see that the United States, I would argue, would not send ground troops to Iraq. This being said, that does not mean that the United States is going to disengage from the region. What I'm arguing instead is that the United States would continue to manage the resources it cultivated in the last 60 or 70 years. Most of those resources are with state institutions, especially the military. Most Arab armies today are trained by the United States, equipped with US arms. Most top generals are trained in Texas, Virginia, and elsewhere. And that's explained, at least partially, why the United States was hesitant to call what happened in Egypt a coup. Because the United States does not want to basically damage the relations with the Arab armies that, at least in the short term, proves to be the most powerful institutions in the ground. The United States, in a nutshell, will not launch any future mega foreign policy initiatives in the region. There will be no Truman or Carter doctrine in the foreseeable future. But the United States would continue to assess the damage, manage the resources it cultivated in the short and medium range. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور محمود حمد الذي حدثنا عن التحول الذي طرأ على ثلاثية
Thank you,
المصالح
Dr.
الأمريكية
Hamad,
خلال فترة
for
الحرب
your
الباردة
presentation.
وكيف أن هذه التغييرات
And
انهيار الشيوعية
how
والنفط والفحم الحجري
the
في الولايات
changes
المتحدة
you
وتنامي
talked
اعتماد
about,
إسرائيل
like
الأمنية على
the
نفسها
collapse of
أدى إلى
communism,
تناقص
Israel's
الاهتمام
reliance
الأمريكي
on its
وتناقص أهمية
own
المنطقة بالنسبة
resources
للولايات
and
المتحدة
other
وسوف
factors
نسمع
which led
مقاربات مختلفة
to
ربما هذا
the
المساء
Arab
عن هذا
world
الموضوع.
being less
أنتقل الآن إلى
important
محدثنا
in the
الثالث
eyes of the
في هذه
United
الجلسة
States.
وهو الدكتور
Now
إبراهيم
we move
شرقية
to Dr. Ibrahim
الذي
Sharqieh,
يعمل زميلا
who is a
بالسياسات الخارجية
fellow,
في معهد
foreign
بروكينغز
policy
وأستاذ
fellow
المنازعات
from
الدولية في جامعة
Brookings
جورج تاون قطر،
and
وقد عمل
lectures
سابقا
at
مستشارا
Georgetown
أكاديميا في سفارة
University,
الإمارات
Qatar,
العربية المتحدة في واشنطن،
and
وقام بتدريس
previously he
وتسوية
was an
النزاعات
advisor
الدولية
to the
في العديد
Emirates
من
Embassy in
الجامعات الأمريكية.
Washington.
حصل على
He
شهادة
has
دكتوراه من
taught
جامعة جورج
many
ميسون
universities. He has his PhD from George Mason 2006. Dr. Ibrahim will be talking to us about maybe a new US foreign policy towards the Arab world.
Shukran, Dr. Marwan. I will speak in Arabic since the paper was written in Arabic, so just to avoid translation of terms and so forth. Shukran.
Thank you once again. What my presentation today will be on shedding light on discussion, on the current discussion on the American influence in the Arab world, whether or not it's on the decrease or it's maintaining the traditional American role or not. And I'll be alluding to both aspects of this discussion: the withdrawal from Iraq, confusion in Syria, reaching understandings with Iran, failure in Palestine on one side, and on the other side, the argument which says that America is keeping to its traditional role, like deposing the Gaddafi regime was necessary, and there'll be no solution or until now in Syria without American leadership, interference in Yemen, and also in Egypt, America kept to its traditional role. In order to reach some sort of a conclusion about American role, I took three main indicators to try and analyze the directions of American policy in the Arab world, which form the basic components of foreign policy. First of all, the energy independence and America's relative independence now, and the hypothesis which says America is heading in the direction of achieving its own independence when it comes to energy sources, and this will necessarily mean less dependence on the Arab source energy sources. Secondly, the redefinition of American foreign policy towards Asia or pivot to Asia. And thirdly, public opinion and the impact of the financial crisis, which will be the main determinants of American foreign policy. Firstly, the question of energy independence. You will see, because of this new discoveries when it comes to from 2012 until now, America's production now is reaching 53%. Between 2007 and 2013, rather. This means that if discoveries continue in this regard, if this continues, this trend continues, then in the 2020s we will see self-sufficiency in the production of crude oil in the United States will be maybe around 90%, and this will mean total independence from Arab oil. And this calls for the position that the US should no longer rely on the Arab world, of course. And the total import of Arab oil is only 15%. So if we look at the last 5, 6 years, which was around 17%, this means that America, secondly, as far as the energy independence question is concerned, the International Energy Authority is saying that in the mid-20s of this century, and also the crude oil in 2019 will suffer some setbacks, and by 2019. So therefore, we can safely say that the question of energy independence will face some real challenges. Thirdly, this new form of oil, which is rather expensive, what an oil field in Iraq produces will be the equivalent of 42 wells in North Dakota. The fourth point here is the United States administration has established what's called Energy Resources Bureau in the days of Hillary Clinton, and in 2011 it had 55 employees. 2014 the number reached 85, which indicates that the United States is focusing more and more on the question of energy independence. Fifthly, rather, the oil as a strategic commodity and its linkage to American national security is not just a question of the consumption of power, and any question of American withdrawal from the energy markets will mean that this provides cheaper oil to China, and this is an important consideration. And we know oil has been used whether during the Cold War or after Saddam's war with Iran has ended. How the United States managed to control the oil prices to maintain the shape of the international world order prevalent at that time. These challenges indicate that even if the United States managed to achieve its independence in its energy resources, the importance of Arab oil will remain because of the importance of oil as a strategic commodity and its relations to the aspects of national security. Also, the question of pivot to Asia, this was a trend in American foreign policy that which made a large number of analysts started redefining this new trend towards Asia Pacific in American foreign policy. And we remember Hillary Clinton's article in Foreign Policy in 2011 in which she said half the population of planet Earth live in Asia Pacific area, and therefore any US investment and interest there will be far bigger and more important than the Middle East. And also Susan Wright's statement that the United States cannot remain engaged in the Middle East 24/7, and these considerations made some analysts discuss this question, and also America's presence through the presence of 330,000 military personnel and civilians back home. This is in comparison to 94,000 American forces through CENTCOM. And also the mutual agreements between Asia and Asia Pacific and the United States. We find 76 with Asia Pacific compared to 23 only with the Middle East. And also the trade between America and the Asia Pacific is 328 billion compared to 84 billion only with the Middle East. And of course, these are important aspects. There are also challenges. First of all, that national security cannot be defined, and the position of the United States in the international world order cannot be determined through economic indicators only. And when we compare America's approach to Asia Pacific and the Middle East, and the visits made by the Secretary of State to the Middle East and the Asia Pacific in the Clinton era, we will see that's Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. 2009, she had 11 visits to the Middle East compared to and if we compare that with John Kerry's term in office in 2013, 2014, John Kerry made a total of 38 visits to the Middle East compared to 13 only to Asia Pacific, 2013, 2014. So therefore, it's clear that this pivot to Asia may be linked to individuals within the administration or different administrations rather than until now being a strategic approach which goes in a certain direction regardless of which administration is in power or the Secretary of State personally, because we see the difference in the approach adopted by John Kerry and Hillary Clinton. In addition to that, the American president, in his statement before the UN in 2013, when he specified the American foreign policies directions, and also when the president also did not fulfill his promise of taking part in the economic summit in 2013 because of budget considerations. And also the third indicator here is the one pertaining to public opinion. We see that there is really real pressure, internal pressure at the level of the public opinion, which pushes towards less engagement and interference in Arab affairs or Middle Eastern affairs, which reached almost 63 calling for less involvement. And after President Morsi was deposed, 78 saw fit that despite Egypt's importance, it's best for the United States not to interfere. And if we compare that to the support of the American war in Afghanistan, which compared to interference in Syria, which is only 9%, in Afghanistan, the support was 88%. So therefore, there is a move or a mood of isolationism. In summary, we say independence in energy resources does not mean less importance attached to Arab oil. Also for Asia Pacific, it's linked to certain individuals and administrations rather than a strategic approach. Thirdly, public opinion is an important factor, and it is probably the determinant factor. These are this leads us to a number of certain characteristics of the American foreign policy. First of all, the United States now it's reducing its role in the Middle East to only a role of deterrence, and also the United States kept that in its policy, the deterrence factor, and compared to state building. And we saw how in the Syrian question, when it threatened the use of power, and then the problem was sorted out through Syria giving up its chemical weapons. And also, when it comes to state building or nation building, American influence has retreated in a very noticeable manner compared to the role of deterrence. Also, suddenly there is the domino effect. American failures go from one failure to another when it comes to constructive roles or solutions. Failure in Iraq and Afghanistan led to a failure in Libya, and also this shows that America kept its deterrent role but failed in any nation building or state building, and Libya is going through a phase of a failed state. Also failure in Palestine and failure in Syria, of course. The third characteristic is what we can call that there was a horizontal retreat in American influence, sorry, the horizontal influence was there, but the perpendicular one. With America's allies of the past are still American influences and allies. Even what happened in Egypt, when America lost its influence first, then it gained it after the 3rd of July. And also, the number of American allies is not on the decrease, but what is on the decrease is Americans' ability to influence these allies. For example, Saudi Arabia now is leading some political trends away from American influence, and also the Palestinian question and the question of the Palestinian Authority, which relies on its daily sustenance on America. See, the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, is moving in a direction away from the United States, not total independence from America, but certainly away from it. As for the horizontal influence in Syria, now Syria was not an ally of America, but the conflict, American conflict, is with Iran and Russia. The other characteristic is the United States has clearly not benefited from any lessons from the Arab Spring, and it seems that the United States is addicted to supporting dictatorial regimes, and even when there is a clash between principles and values, it's clear that the United States is still addicted to the interest side of the equation and supporting the dictatorial regimes. In a nutshell, where do we go from here? What does all of this mean to the Arabs? This is a conference about the Arab world and the United States. Despite some retreat of the American influence, as we said, we should not exaggerate and jump into conclusions that the United States has become a neutral factor for the Middle East. The American influence is still there, and the deterrent role is still there, and it's still consistent with exercising influence without having boots on the ground. Secondly, the Arabs should not wait for any solutions from the United States. They should focus more on their own internal solutions based on their own political, cultural, and social aspects, and focus on homegrown solutions. And the failure of outside solutions, and Iraq is a vivid example compared to what's happening now in Iraq compared to homegrown models like what happened in Tunisia, which are moving in the direction of achieving some solid advances and changes through homegrown solutions rather than outside imposed solutions. So therefore Arabs have to search for their own internal solutions. If the United States had the ability in the past to provide some solutions, now it's evidently clear that this is no longer the case, and American influence is only in the side of deterrence. Thirdly, the Arabs are in need of engaging in real dialogue away from hegemony and based on a balanced approach and equality rather than dominance. It's clear that for the Arabs at least that they should move towards a more balanced dialogue away from dominance, especially in view of the changes which took place as a result of American policy. Also, a conflict and clashing with the United States is not an inevitability, and in the future the conflict and contradictions between this area and the United States will be determined by the total American support of the Israeli project in the area, and this may also answer Dr. Azmi Bishara's question that historically speaking, America stood against the Islamist movements, Arab pan-nationalism and Palestinian national movement, and the American support of Israel was the determining factor, and there will be no solutions unless through America changing its policy in that regard so that a new shape can be drawn for the relationships. Arabs have to benefit from the American public opinion, which rejects strongly American interference. Fifthly, Arabs should be frightened of what's called a pivot to Asia, Asia Pacific, because the Arab world remains important for reasons of its own and not because the alternatives or the lack of them, whether in the Asia Pacific or not. Thank you for your kind attention.
شكرا دكتور إبراهيم
Thank
شرقية
you,
على
Dr.
هذه
Ibrahim Sharqieh,
المداخلة
for this
التي تناول
presentation,
فيها وجهتين
in which
نظر
he
متعارضتين
elaborated on
حول
two
ما إذا
contradictory
كانت
points of
أهمية
views
المنطقة
about
قدرت بالنسبة
the
للولايات المتحدة
importance of this region
وانتهى
for the
إلى أن
United
التناقص
States,
ربما
and
مرتبط
concluded
بالتأثير
that
أو
the
مرتبط
decrease of
بأن
interest
التأثير
is
على
related
المنطقة
to
أكثر
the
منها مرتبطا
capability of US to influence the region more than being related to it.
ربما هذا الموضوع سوف يتم
This
تناوله بشكل
topic will
مفصل
be
أكثر
detailed
في
in
جلسات
more
بعد
details
عندما
during the
نتحدث عن
afternoon
موضوع الأمن
sessions. We'll
والمواقع
speak
في
about
العلاقات
security
العربية
and energy in
الأمريكية.
Arab-American
متحدثنا الأخير
relations.
في
The
هذه
last
الجلسة
speaker in this
هو السيد
session will
ديفيد
be
أوتوي،
Mr.
وهو
David
باحث
Ottaway,
أول في
who's
مركز
a
وودرو ويلسون.
senior
عمل طوال
researcher in
35 عاما
Woodrow
مراسلا
Wilson
لصحيفة واشنطن
Center and
بوست،
worked for
إذ
the
غطى
Washington
أخبار
Post for
الشرق
a long
الأوسط
time
وأفريقيا
and covered the
وجنوب
Middle
أوروبا
East,
قبل أن
Africa,
ينتقل
and
لتغطية
South
شؤون الأمن
Africa
القومي
affairs
صحفيا من
before
واشنطن، ثم تقاعد في
and
العام
then he
2006
retired in
ونال شهادة
2006,
الدكتوراه من
obtained
جامعة
his
كولومبيا
PhD from
في
Columbia
نيويورك، وترشح
University in New
مرتين
York and was
لجائزة
2 times
بولتزر
candidate for Winsor
للإعلاميين.
Reward
السيد
for
أوتوي
Media People.
يحدثنا
Ms.
عن
Ottaway will be
محاولة
speaking
إزالة
about the
أوباما
Obama
إيجاد سياسة
administration's search
خارجية
for
في
a
الشرق
new Middle
الأوسط
East
والذي
Gulf
تفرض.
policy. I give him the floor.
Good morning. I want to talk to you specifically about what's going on in Washington and its thinking about U.S. policy generally and where the U.S. attitude fits in regarding the Gulf. It's very difficult to say what U.S. policy towards the Gulf is going to be because so much depends on the outcome of our talks with Iran. And you almost have to draw two different scenarios regarding our attitude towards the Gulf, depending on whether there is an agreement on the nuclear issue with Iran or it falls apart. So with that caveat, and a second caveat, which is I have never, in my time of working at the Washington Post since 1971, seen the United States in such crisis with its three key allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and even Israel, or at least Netanyahu. This is an extraordinary juncture. And as I say, it's unprecedented in the time that I've been in and out of covering the Middle East. Having said that, I want to also remind us that the U.S. has repeatedly gone through times of testing, times of questioning in our relationship with the GCC states. And when I started writing at the Washington Post, I had to deal with the Arab boycott of 1973, led by Saudi Arabia, our main ally. Every decade has seen a time of testing and questioning about what is the nature and the substance of the relationship between the GCC states and the United States. The other thing, before I get into the Obama doctrine towards the Gulf, I want to just remind us also about the nature of our engagement with the GCC states. And I want to remind us that the U.S. has no legal obligation to defend its Arab partners in the Gulf, the way it does its NATO allies, Japan and South Korea. Only Kuwait and Bahrain are even regarded as, quote, major non-NATO allies. Third observation, Saudi Arabia has always wanted to keep the United States military presence over the horizon and out of the kingdom, to keep its own public distance from the United States, which makes for a very difficult relationship, made more difficult by Saudi Arabia kicking the United States Air Force out after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and also closing down our major forward logistics base, which we had in Saudi Arabia, and then it was moved here to Qatar. Fourth, despite having no legal obligations, the U.S. has made repeated verbal commitments to the defense of the Arab states, and we've actually done it in the case of during the Iran-Iraq war with a flagging of Kuwaiti tankers, and we did it again during the first Gulf War, and we sent 500,000 troops to Saudi Arabia. The fifth observation, we have kept redefining what is, as we perceive it, what is the enemy that we have to deal with in the Gulf. It used to be the Soviet Union, then it changed to Iraq, and now it's Iran. And the sixth and final observation, practically every U.S. president has had his own doctrine towards the Gulf, shaped by events on the ground, the perceived threats at the time, and whether the U.S. was becoming involved in a war or extracting itself from a war around the world. And regarding this, are we getting into wars or coming out of wars? There's a great book that's just come out by my friend Steve Sestanovich, Columbia professor, who has tracked the cyclical engagements and disengagements of the United States around the world since World War II. This book is called The Maximalist, and what he means by the maximalists are the most proactive, aggressive presidents of the United States who have gotten us involved in military engagements. Presidents like Truman and Reagan, and then the Bush Jr., Bush 43 as we say. And these presidents have been maximalists, and then there have been a reaction to that, those engagements and those wars Sestanovich calls them presidents favoring a retrenchment of American involvement in the world, which you might well call the minimalist presidents. And these have been presidents like Eisenhower, Nixon, and now Obama. Now, how do we deal with the Obama doctrine now in light of this cyclical process of engagement and disengagement by various U.S. presidents? And how does it apply to the Middle East? I find Obama's speech to the United Nations last September the most revealing of his thinking about his notion of our interest now in the Gulf. And he said at that point, the U.S. has only 4 core interests, for which it would use, quote, all elements of our power, including military force. And he listed the 4. Confronting an external aggression against U.S. allies and partners, assuring the free flow of oil and gas from the Gulf to the outside world, dismantling terrorist networks that threaten our people, quote unquote, which he meant the U.S. people, and 4, to prevent the use of weapons of mass destruction. Otherwise, it was going to be multinational approach towards any U.S. involvement in the region. And he said he was only going to concentrate on 2 issues for the rest of his time in office. That was the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations and Iran. I find Obama really almost, fascinated by Iran and whether he can bring off an opening to Iran. And it reminds me of Iran is to him what China was to Nixon. How to make peace with a major country of major importance with which we had no diplomatic relations. The U.S. had not formally recognized the People's Republic of China for 30 years and only established relations with China in 1979. the U.S. has not had diplomatic relations with Iran since 1980, or 34 years. And if you read what he had to say about Iran, he said that if we had a nuclear agreement with Iran, we can, quote, that can serve as a major step down a long road towards a different relationship, one based on mutual interest and mutual respect. And he has carried out, there are interesting parallels between Kissinger sneaking off and going to China, and Obama sending a team led by Bill Burns, number 3 in the State Department, number 2 in the State Department, holding secret talks in Oman with the Iranians last year. Now, one of the themes to me that's very interesting, and I'm going to talk about this now because I'm going to compare it to the Nixon doctrine later. One of the major themes of the Obama doctrine is emphasis on the shift in the burden of defense spending from the U.S. to our regional partners and allies. And this was spelled out very clearly by Chuck Hagel, Secretary of Defense, in Manamana last December. Quote, going forward, the Department of Defense will place even more emphasis on building the capacity of our partners in order to complement our strong military presence in the region. Our goal is for our allies and partners to be stronger and more capable of dealing with common threats. Now, there are, to my mind, striking parallels between the Obama doctrine and the Nixon doctrine, which President Nixon had spelled out as he was trying to extricate the United States from the Vietnam War. Both presidents, I think, are minimalist when it comes to involvement in foreign policy, and both were trying to get us out of wars. He spelled out his doctrine, this is Nixon's doctrine, in 1969 in the following terms. 1, the U.S. would stick to all its treaty commitments. 2, the U.S. would provide a shield, a nuclear shield, if another nuclear power threatened an ally, or, quote, a nation whose survival we consider vital to our security, unquote. In all other cases of aggression, the U.S. would provide military and economic assistance when requested in accordance with our treaty commitments. But we shall look to the nation directly threatened to assume the primary responsibility of providing the manpower for its defense. So you get the same thrust of shifting the burden of defense from the United States to our local partners. Then there are very similar domestic circumstances that Nixon faced and Obama faces. Extracting the United States from wars, facing budget cuts across the board, but particularly for defense at home, a war-weary public, American public, and deep skepticism about the value of ongoing U.S. military engagements. And the same doubts, and why are we in Vietnam? You feel the same thing in Washington now. You know, what did we get out of our involvement in Afghanistan, and what in the world did we get out of our invasion of Iraq? Now, in the case of the Gulf, this shift in the burden of defense spending from the U.S. to our local allies is really well underway. And there have been massive increases in U.S. arms sales to our partners of the GCC to make their own self-defense more possible. And I looked at, Nixon dealt with the Shah and counted on the Shah to be the sort of main pillar in the 70s. And the Pentagon, the Shah put in orders for $16 billion of the most sophisticated U.S. arms available. and I looked up what's 16 billion worth today, in accounting for inflation, and it comes out to $68 billion, which is about what Saudi Arabia is buying from the United States in terms of arms. Very interesting parallel of terms of actual amounts. Well, now I've spoken about the parallels between the opening, Nixon trying to open to China and the U.S. to Iran. There's another very eerie parallel going on right now. The South Vietnamese government collapsed within a year of our withdrawal from Vietnam. And when you see what's going on, the quick collapse of the Iraqi army over the last week, there really are eerie parallels between what's happening in Iraq today and what happened with our South Vietnam government after we withdrew. Now, there are certainly non-parallels between the Nixon doctrine and the Obama doctrine. I mean, we were in the Cold War, a global Cold War, back in the 70s, and Iran is hardly a military threat to the United States as the same magnitude of China or Russia. And there are some interesting non-parallels also. Nixon developed that, I don't know if you all remember, what was called the twin pillar policy towards the Gulf of relying in theory on both Iran and Saudi Arabia to sort of keep the peace and stability in the Gulf. But it was clearly, Nixon sided with Iran because it had the military capability and Saudi Arabia was just getting organized and militarily, and so the tilt was very much towards Iran. I don't think there's any chance that we're ever going to see, even if there is a nuclear agreement, that kind of tilt towards Iran again. There are just too many differences between us and the Iranians to think that we're ever going to rely on Iran for the security of the Gulf. And all our investment in military buildup is on the Arab side, not on the Iranian side. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up, Obama, when he spoke last fall, said nothing about what the U.S. would do if Iran got nuclear weapons. Nixon said we would defend not only our allies, but any nation we considered crucial to our security. Obama does not even speak about how we would behave if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, although this is, of course, the main preoccupation of Saudi Arabia. He just says we'll use all weapons or all methods that are at our disposal, including military. But he doesn't talk about. Hillary Clinton had talked about extending a nuclear. He said defense umbrella, but in the context she meant a nuclear umbrella to the Gulf. She clearly had some idea of what we would do or could do, but Obama has not mentioned this at all in his speech then or since. So in conclusion, I really come back, what is the Obama doctrine towards the Gulf? I think it's really going to depend on what happens on the ground and how we handle Iraq now, whether we have an agreement with Iran or we don't have an agreement, and so that we will not be able to really get a clear sense of the Obama doctrine towards the Gulf until these two issues are resolved. Thank you.
We thank Dr. Ottaway for this intervention, and he gave us a comparison between the Nixon and Obama doctrines. And in view of the similarities, we see now what happened, the American war of attrition in Vietnam and the last 10 years of attrition America has experienced in the last 10 years. Now we open the floor for questions and answers. Please do not take more than 2 minutes making your comment or posing your question, because we want to allow as much time as possible for everyone. Please state your name and affiliation. Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Isam Abdul Shafi. I am a lecturer of international relations. There are different observations. My first observation to Ambassador Murphy, I hope that the Americans should revisit their declared principles before World War I and how they are dealing with the Arab world and their missionary vision then and the lack of it now. And my second observation is about or some reservations I have on Dr. Sharqieh's paper, and to say that there were, before 1991, 3 main American strategic considerations, and now the situation has changed. I think there is a resetting of priorities. First, there was the Soviet Union, oil, and Israel. After 91 and 2001, rather, is terrorism. And all in all, I don't think there is a single Arab country in which there is no American influence. So I disagree with the American influence being on the retreat, as some claims, but maybe it's some sort of redeployment and policies of containment. Another observation, Dr. Ibrahim, you talked about the failure of American policies in the Arab world. How do you define failure, and upon what standards? Is it failure from the point of view of Arabs or the point of view of Americans? Thank you.
مرحبا. عماد منصور, أستاذ بجامعة قطر. I will pose my questions in English to Ambassador Murphy and Dr. Ottaway. Ambassador Murphy, I would like you to talk, if you can, please, about the transformation that happened in American foreign policy making to move from a position that, as you frame it, was a bit, suspicious of the movement or of the creation or the momentum that really led up to the creation of the State of Israel, and what really precipitated that change in the American worldview or the position on the issue, please, if you can. And Dr. Ottaway, I mean, really, I don't have the time to, to pose my question, but do you think that it's really problematic to make that analogy between China and Iran? I mean, in one case, we're talking about a major power whose existence of the world was and is independent of the position of the United States. And certainly in the relationship with the cynic states in the vicinity of China, Iran is a different really story altogether. And the engagement really would request more proactive foreign policy, or maybe really grand strategy on behalf of the United States. So isn't it really problematic to make that analogy between China and Iran and then proceed to find out maybe ways of dealing with Iran based on the history that the US dealt with China? Thank you.
أحمد إبراهيم أبو شوق جامعة قطر. Just I'll raise my question to Mahmoud Hamad and Ibrahim Sharqieh regarding the American foreign policy in the regions. If we look at American foreign policy in the region from a historical perspective, as you mentioned, we notice that the American foreign policy is based on 3 pillars, as you mentioned: the control of the oil and the security of the state of Israel, and the suppression of the communism in the regions. But this equation has been changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The question here, when you look at the increase of the oil production in the United States of America and the growing interest in the Pacific and the public opinion, you address it as a push factor. But I feel that you need also to address the role of the growing interest of China in the regions and to what extent would affect the American foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you. دكتور خليل تفضل.
I have 2 questions. My first question is to Dick Murphy, and my second question is to Ibrahim. My first question to Mr. Murphy, when it comes to American interests, we used to meet on monthly basis at the Department of State on behalf of the American Arab community. American officials used to summarize that in 8 to 10 points as American interests in the region. In the long years during which you served at the State Department, these interests have not changed, or the list has not changed, although the situation has changed, especially when the Cold War and competition with the Soviet Union is no longer a factor, and the addition of the war on terror after 9/11, but probably the rest of the American interests are as much as they used to be before, despite the changes. There is a book by a person you may remember, Seth Tillman, who was the chief of staff at the Foreign Relations Policy, when he wrote about American interests. And he said, when you read these interests separately, you do not find anything wrong in the United States foreign policy, but when you read the list together, you will find some fundamental contradictions. For example, the United States policy towards Palestine and the American foreign policy with the rest of the Arab countries who call for a different policy towards Palestine, but nothing happens. Do you think the time has come to reformulate American interests and policies towards the Arab world to minimize the gap between these interests and the changes in reality? Dr. Ibrahim, American public opinion makes the American policy, or is it the other way around? Can you please respond? Thank you. Omar Zbidi from Sirat Center. There is an important point for Mr. Mahmoud. He spoke about the importance of the region. I think the region will keep its importance for the United States regardless of other factors or other areas like Asia or others. This area has caused a threat to the United States through 9/11 events, what the United States has spent through wars, despite, I'm talking about daily continuous operations in Yemen and not any covert operations, and intelligence engagement and other. This all costs money, and the United States has multiplied the budget for the intelligence services by threefold and this is pertaining to Egypt, the Gulf, and the Horn of Africa. Qatar, for example, is the #1 country in exporting gas. Saudi Arabia is an important country when it comes to exporting oil. These are important considerations. Thank you. Thank you, Khalil Anani from Johns Hopkins University. I think it's a form of exaggeration to say that the American role is on the retreat, and we must look at this through cost-benefit analysis. In the past, the approach was different than the current approach. Now we see the American support of Israel is done through the role of the Israeli lobby and internal factors. So therefore, American support of Israel will continue for as long as these lobbies and interest groups continue. Secondly, Israel is the largest recipient of American economic aid. Thirdly, the the question of stability in the area, and this stability is linked to what extent America can influence the oil market, the oil prices, and remember what happened 2008 when the oil prices jumped from 70 to 120. This cost the American Treasury a lot, so therefore America is keen on maintaining oil prices at a reasonable level. And thirdly, since 9/11, the Middle East is within the scope of American national security, and therefore there is a vested interest to combat terrorism because this is an integral part of American national security. So this is not looked at through the cost-benefit analysis, but maybe minimizing the cost only. Thank you very much for all the speakers. I want to comment on the point made by some speakers that American interference is on the retreat. I disagree with those who say there is a retreat, but there is a change in the type of intervention and its level, maybe. This change is governed or impacted by the changes in American priorities in different phases. It's true that there are some constant factors which will always determine the level of American interference, starting with the strategic relations with Israel. This is a permanent factor, and economic factors, but in the days of the Cold War, the priorities were of a security nature to contain the threat of the Soviet Union and the ideology that follows. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was another idea of the clash of civilizations, cultures, etc., which also determined the type of American intervention. Now we are seeing also security considerations, combating terrorism as important influences in American intervention. And I think these determinants will change and differ, but will mean one thing, that the administration now seeks a kind of intervention which is least costly and make the Arab side bear some of the costs. And also there is a change in the nature of intervention, but not in the size of it. So therefore we should redefine this relationship again. And I agree with Dr. Ibrahim that we should take into account the balance in interests, but one of the constant factors will remain the relationship with Israel. Thank you. I'm sure all of you have the chance to speak in one session or another. We may not be able
Shukran
to
jazilan.
cover
Zuhair Hamdi
all
from
in
the
one
Arab
session.
Center and Research and Policy Studies. I would like first of all to talk about the myth of energy independence in the US. This myth is a very old myth, and the US has never been able actually to achieve this objective. And we just remember the energy independence project of the Nixon administration in the 70s after the oil crisis of 1973, 1974. Actually, the energy independence project was a major failure as far as energy is concerned in the US. And the US saw its energy dependency actually increase after 1973. So talking about the US reaching sometime even in the future an energy independence, I think that this is not really realistic. And all the figures that we are getting from the shale oil development in the US, even experts are becoming more and more less optimistic about the long term, and they are reconsidering certain figures in that respect. Secondly, as far as the Arab region and oil are concerned, oil is an international commodity and a strategic commodity, and the issue is not whether you depend on it for your own consumption or not, but the issue is the role of oil in the international economy. Since the discovery of shale oil or the shale oil revolution in the US, there has been indeed a shift in oil trade, and more oil trade is traded to Asia now than to the West in general and the US. So for the US, it will be still important, even if it does not import oil from the Gulf, to be able to influence the international oil market, because China is a big competitor and because China and Asia is an important economic and strategic region. So in that respect, I think we have to be careful. In addition, the decrease of importance of the Arab oil is not a new story. It is an old story that we have already heard when Caspian oil was discovered, and there was more talk about the decreasing importance of the Gulf in that respect. And this has proven to be wrong, and we know very well that discoveries were very limited in the Caspian, and that they could not replace the Gulf oil. Just one last point, if I may, concerning the think tanks, in the U.S., Arab think tanks in the U.S., or the failure of Arab think tanks in the U.S. We have seen recently, since the military coup in Egypt, actually two very active Arab lobbies in the U.S., namely the Saudi and the UAE. They are extremely, active in the U.S., and they have proven to be very efficient and to know very well how the U.S. system works. So the issue is not the fact that there are no Arab think tanks in the U.S. The fact is that the ones that exist are not, if you want, directed for Arab interests in general, but for very specific interests that are related to very specific regime interests for Arab countries. Thank you very much.
Anthony Kurtzman.
I would just briefly like to point out that everybody has their own energy estimates, but the United States government officially makes those estimates through the Energy Information Agency. The key dependence the U.S. has on energy is not in BTUs, it is in liquids. The United States government does not estimate import dependence in its reference case dropping below 32%, and it shows it rising in the late 2030s. But the other problem I see here is people are only looking at direct import dependence. We have about $1.4 trillion worth of annual imports. 8% of that is oil. 86% is manufactured goods. Those goods come in large part from Asia and from 3 countries extremely dependent on Arab oil: China, Japan, and South Korea. When we do strategic assessments in the government of energy dependence, we don't do it in direct imports. We do it in the total impact of import dependence. And any calculation which ignores indirect imports and our dependence on the global economy and doesn't quantify it is totally irrelevant to U.S. policy.
Thank you very much. شكرا جزيلا. أنا أعتذر من
Thank you. I'm sorry. I apologize for all who I could not give the floor. I promised them that I will give them the floor in other sessions. Now we give 2 minutes to each of the panelists to answer the questions that they were raised for them.
دقيقتين.
2 minutes only, please. Mr. Ambassador, السيد السفير لك أن تبدأ.
Well, is it time to reformulate American policy? We're, at this point in time, we're in an incredibly complex shifting of opinions and problems on the Arab world, in the Arab world, in American foreign policy. And one thing that nobody has mentioned is changes in the American Jewish community towards a fascination with the younger generation's ideas and so-called J Street Foundation. And the J Street is a younger generation, very committed to the security of Israel and very much at odds with the policies of the current Israeli government, accused of being traitors, etc., by the older generation who remain convinced that there should be never any criticism of Israel. The changes in American policy are going to have to go hand in hand with these changes in the American Jewish policy, Jewish communities policy. And I think that's underway, but it's a slow process. Yes, it would be nice if our policies were as fully principled as they were before the First World War towards the Middle East, but in all honesty, we really didn't have a policy at that time. And as our interests grew, the gaps between our values and our principles, as I said, has grown. You can't run a country following the men of leaders of religion. To me, that's just a truism. But well, I think that's all I should say.
We have to leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mahmoud.
I will answer in Arabic because most of the questions were in Arabic, so I'll answer in Arabic. Some of the questions were about the terrorism, about democracy, and the pillars of the American policies in the region. I think that these 3 points cannot compensate the loss of the importance of the Soviet Union in 1991. Regarding terrorism, United States is practicing or trying in the past period to combat terrorism in a very limited way in cooperation with Arab countries. Regardless of the intelligence services, most of the combat against terrorism is made by CIA and by the drones. Spreading democracy, I think, is no longer a strategic goal for the United States in the region. We must remember that this goal was adopted in Bush's times and not Obama's. Weapons of mass destruction, I think they are being, the Syrian weapons of destruction are being eliminated now, and there is no such threat in this domain. As for oil, I did not say that the United States will not need any importations of oil. No. What I said that oil will not have a political role in putting pressure on USA. لن تستخدم النفط كسلاح ضد الولايات المتحدة. And there's a big difference between the two expressions. As for the calculations between benefits and losses, I know that the losses in dealing with the Arab countries are much more than benefits. Frankly speaking, the growing importance of the Asian economically of the Asian countries is very brings the attention of USA investments, and if we take into consideration the regression that the American economy is knowing now, and we would know that the historical role of America with Asia will be something natural, especially that USA, historically speaking, was interested and focused on Asia. Retreat in this interest in USA was after the big failures at the Vietnam, the Korean Wars. Now, USA is going back to Asia, and this is not something that is designed by Obama only. No, the beginnings of that were with the Clintons and then Bush. As for the Arab lobbies, yes, in the Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, do spend a lot of money to have influence on some parts of the American foreign policies. But their real influence is that this lobby is usually in line with the conservatives' right and the Jewish lobbies. Thank you. I thank you for these important questions. In fact, the yardstick for failure or criteria is important. In fact, failure, there's a sort of fluidity in using this word failure. Sometimes when I take the American yardstick, sometimes another kind of yardstick. But usually one should speak of failure from the yardstick of reaching solutions that are satisfactory to both parties. For example, in Libya, the American yardstick was to topple the regime, but this by itself was not enough because Libya is going into a civil war, has a very important repercussions on this for the security of the whole region, and so failure should be taken and studied on the standards of both sides, and that's why you say that in Iraq, USA had failed, and also in Libya and in Palestine. As for China and the American foreign policies from Chinese lenses, this, of course, is one of the main criteria that governs the U.S. foreign policy in the region, because any withdrawal from the region means that it will give place for the increase of the Chinese role, especially in the energy sector. By the way, if 85% of the Chinese energy is from the Arab oil, and this number is expected to go even higher. As for Dr. Khalil's question, it was a very difficult question. Of course, I agree with you I cannot deny that the statements of the officials are very important in building and making the American public opinion. But in fact, we must take into consideration what is there at the present time. There's a big rejection and there's this war fatigue with the public opinion in USA, regardless of the source of this influence. Finally, أنا أحذر بشكل كبير I caution that one should not judge policies by general principles or general statements. I hear so much that the American policies are in retreat. I don't think such generalization is correct. The American policies did not retreat in deterrence or in destruction of anyone, as was we said in Libya and Syria when there was any. But in the field of state building and nation building, yes, there is a lot of retreat. There are many. There are no such. And you must remember that the strength of striking and destruction do not represent a solution. The drones war in Yemen might continue for years, but Al Qaeda 10 years ago were weaker than they are now. So this deterrence by drones has led to strengthening Al Qaeda and not to weakening it. Thank you.
David?
Regarding the parallels and non-parallel between China and Iran, and it is exaggerated. I pointed out that we're not in the Cold War. Iran is not a direct threat to the United States. What are the parallels? Nixon was trying to initiate détente with both China and the Soviet Union. Obama is trying to initiate détente with Iran. So and détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Just lower the volume and avoid, lessen the level of conflict in the Gulf region. But what strikes me is whether or not, Nixon had succeeded in opening the door to China, we weren't going to go to war with China. If Obama's efforts to negotiate an agreement on the nuclear issue fails, you can easily create a scenario where either Israel or the United States, depending on what the Iranian reaction is, end up going to war with Iran, which is going to affect everybody in the Gulf. So the consequences of a failure to have an agreement with Iran are much more dangerous in my mind than the potential failure Kissinger and Nixon faced of not succeeding with China.
Thank you very much.
Shukran jazilan. At the end of this session, this marathon session, for two reasons. One, that we have seen here for 2 years, 2 hours and a half, consecutive 2 hours and a half. And second reason is that we have covered 100 years of Arab-American relations from the First World War, 1914 to 2014. Thank you very much for your patience and attentive listening. And I also thank all the panelists for their valuable interventions. And now we take a break for half an hour before we resume the sessions of this conference. Thank you.